Chapter 1. The journey begins. Jane Parsons stepped onto the platform of Euston Station with a rare sense of excitement. The Grand Island Express stood before her, gleaming under the overcast sky like a beacon of adventure. It was a sleek and modern train, the pride of the British Railways, promising a smooth and luxurious journey from London to Dublin. For Jane, however, this journey represented something far more precious: rest. She breathed in the crisp autumn air, relishing the cool breeze that brushed past her. It had been months since she'd taken any time for herself, her days consumed by one case after another. From solving the theft of the Royal Submarine Treaty to catching a serial killer in the fog-choked streets of London, her reputation had grown considerably, but it had also left her drained. The Ireland Express was meant to be her escape, a brief holiday far from her responsibilities. Jane was travelling light, a single suitcase in hand, but her mind, ever sharp and vigilant, carried the weight of countless unsolved mysteries. She had promised herself not to think of work during this trip. "You need to rest, Jane," she reminded herself. "No more mysteries for a while." As she stepped into her first-class compartment, she allowed herself a small smile. The cabin was elegant, with plush seating, polished wood panels, and velvet curtains framing the large window. The rhythmic clatter of the station, the scent of coal and steel, and the gentle murmur of passengers filled the air. Everything seemed perfect for a tranquil journey ahead. Settling in, Jane's eyes wandered, taking in the other travellers boarding the train. It was an eclectic mix of people, some looking eager for adventure, others burdened by their own private affairs. Across from her, a tall, wiry man in a tailored suit supervised two porters carrying his luggage, a stern-looking fellow who radiated authority. Behind him stood a woman in her mid-30s, her face pale and drawn, dressed in modest but well-made clothes. She carried a small suitcase and moved with quiet grace. "Would you care for some tea, ma'am?" The voice of a stewardess interrupted her thoughts. Jane looked up to see a young woman in a crisp uniform, a pleasant smile on her face. "Yes, thank you," she replied, relaxing slightly. As she took her tea, Jane spotted another figure stepping onto the train. An older man, balding, with a sharp nose, and small, wire-rimmed glasses perched on the edge of it. He was speaking in hushed tones to a younger man by his side, whose expression was one of pure deference. Jane couldn't make out their words, but the older man's commanding gestures spoke of influence, perhaps a businessman or politician. The Ireland Express's whistle sounded, and with a gentle lurch, the train began to pull away from the station. She leaned back, savouring the motion of the train as it gathered speed, cutting through the countryside with ease. Fields of green stretched out beyond the window, rolling hills dotted with grazing sheep. The scenery, a stark contrast to the grey streets of London. For the first time in months, Jane allowed herself to relax. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of the train lull her into a state of calm. Yet, even in this peaceful setting, her mind couldn't entirely shut off. She thought again of the passengers she'd observed, particularly the three individuals who had stood out to her. The tall man in the suit, there was something severe about him, perhaps a military background. His posture was too rigid, his eyes too calculating. And the pale woman, what had caused her to seem so anxious? Was she escaping something? Or someone? Then there was the older gentleman, speaking in whispers. His body language screamed of secrecy, and the younger man seemed too obedient to be merely an assistant. A knock on her compartment door pulled her out of her musings. The stewardess returned, carrying a small, neatly folded note. "Pardon me, ma'am. This was delivered for you," the stewardess said, placing the note on the small table on the side. Jane frowned slightly. She hadn't expected correspondence, certainly not on this train. She unfolded the note and quickly scanned its contents. "Be careful who you trust on this journey. Not everyone is who they seem." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. "Excuse me," she called after the stewardess. "Who delivered this note?" The stewardess paused, brow furrowed. "I'm not sure, ma'am. I found it with the tea service. Could have been one of the other staff." She dismissed the stewardess and stared down at the note once more. It seemed innocuous enough, just a few words scrawled in neat, even handwriting, but its message carried an unmistakable weight. Was it a warning? A threat? And who had sent it? As the countryside blurred past her window, Jane realized her restful holiday might be over before it had even begun. The train rumbled on, the dining car bustling with activity as passengers took their seats for dinner. Jane joined the crowd, slipping into a corner seat, her eyes scanning the room. The man in the suit was there, sitting stiffly at a table by himself, a glass of wine untouched before him. The pale woman, too, sat alone, nervously picking at her food, while the older gentleman and his companion dined together in hushed conversation. As Jane sipped her own wine, her thoughts kept returning to the note. Who on this train could be trusted? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Suddenly, the train jerked slightly as it passed through a tunnel, the lights flickering for just a moment. When they came back on, Jane noticed a change in the air, a certain tension that hadn't been there before. Across the room, the tall man's hand tightened around his glass, his eyes narrowing as if on high alert. The pale woman dropped her fork with a small clatter, her hands trembling. Something was brewing. Jane could feel it, and then a scream pierced the air. The dining car froze. Every head turned toward the back of the room, where a stewardess stood, her face drained of color. "Someone's been killed," she cried. In that instant, Jane knew her holiday was truly over. A murder had been committed on the Ireland Express. Chapter 2. A Death in the Night. The piercing scream echoed through the dining car, chilling the passengers into stunned silence. All eyes were on the stewardess, her face drained of color, as she stood trembling at the far end of the carriage. For a brief moment, the only sound was the steady rhythm of the train, the clattering of wheels against steel rails as they sped through the night. Jane Parsons was the first to react. Rising swiftly from her seat, she crossed the dining car and approached the stewardess, who was clutching the doorway for support. "Who's been killed?" Jane asked. The tone broke through the stewardess's shock, and she blinked rapidly, her breath coming in short gasps. Mr. Manning," she stammered. "In his compartment. There's so much blood." The name struck a chord in Jane's memory. Mr. Albert Manning, the older gentleman she'd seen earlier, the one with the air of authority. A wealthy industrialist, if her instincts were correct. And now, according to this frightened stewardess, he was dead. The passengers began to stir, murmuring in growing alarm. The panic was palpable, rippling through the room like a current. Some stood from their tables, uncertain whether to flee or investigate, while others sat frozen, as if hoping the whole thing might somehow be a mistake. "Show me," she instructed the stewardess. The young woman nodded shakily and turned, leading Jane through the corridor that connected the dining car to the rest of the train. At last, they reached the compartment at the far end. The door was ajar, revealing a small but luxurious cabin meant for first-class passengers. The curtains had been drawn, leaving the room bathed in a dim, suffocating glow from the small lamp on the table. And there, slumped over the chaise near the window, was Albert Manning. Jane stepped inside, her gaze sweeping the scene with the trained eye of a seasoned investigator. Manning's once proud figure now lay limp and lifeless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his white shirt stained with a dark spreading blotch of blood near the chest. The floor beneath him was splattered with crimson, and there was no mistaking the cause of death. A deep, vicious stab wound just above the heart. Jane had seen many such scenes before. Death was never pleasant, but it was her job to face it head-on. "Has anyone else been in here?" she asked the stewardess, who stood hesitantly by the door, as if afraid to enter the bloodied space. "No one, ma'am. I came to check on Mr. Manning after he didn't show for dinner. The door was already open when I arrived. Jane nodded. Did you see anyone near this compartment before you discovered the body? The stewardess shook her head. No, ma'am. I didn't see anyone in the corridor. Jane stepped closer to the body, crouching down to inspect the wound. The blade had pierced cleanly through the fabric of his shirt, short, precise, as if wielded by someone who knew what they were doing. No signs of a struggle in the room. It suggested a sudden attack, perhaps while Mr. Manning was caught off guard. Who had access to this compartment? Jane asked, her mind already turning to potential suspects. Only Mr. Manning had the key, the stewardess replied, though we keep a master key in the conductor's office for emergencies. And who else might have known about this key? Jane asked. Only the train staff, I believe, the stewardess answered nervously. But we've never had an issue like this before. Jane stood, her gaze still fixed on the scene. Manning had been a man of importance, no doubt about that. But importance came with enemies. Wealthy industrialists like him were often involved in tangled business affairs, each one fraught with tension and competition. There could be any number of reasons someone might have wanted him dead. She stepped back, her eyes scanning the room again, noting the untouched glass of whiskey on the table, the open suitcase with neatly packed clothes, a man prepared for a brief but comfortable journey. There was nothing out of place in the room aside from the bloodied body. Suddenly, the door behind her creaked open, and a voice spoke from the entrance. What's going on here? Jane turned to see a tall man standing in the doorway. It was the stern-faced passenger she had noticed earlier, the one with the military posture and sharp gaze. He frowned as his eyes landed on Manning's lifeless form. I heard the commotion, he said, his voice cold. Is that Mr. Manning? Jane didn't answer immediately. She took a moment to study him, noticing the way his hands were clasped tightly behind his back, his jaw clenched as if trying to maintain control. Yes, she replied, her tone guarded. And you are? Charles Dunbar, he said curtly, stepping into the room. I was traveling with Manning on business. Business, you say? Jane asked. What kind of business? Dunbar's eyes flickered. That's not something I care to discuss right now, he said sharply. I need to know everything you can tell me about Mr. Manning and your dealings with him. Dunbar hesitated, glancing briefly at the stewardess still lingering by the door. Not here. I'll meet you in the lounge. Jane nodded, allowing him to leave. As soon as he was gone, she turned to the stewardess. Find the conductor and have him secure this room. No one is to enter until I finish my investigation. The stewardess nodded quickly and hurried off, leaving Jane alone with the body. She took one last glance around the room, her mind buzzing with questions. Whoever had killed Manning had done so with precision and intent. The message had been clear, a deliberate act, not a crime of passion. Jane's instincts told her that Dunbar wasn't being entirely honest, but she wasn't ready to draw conclusions just yet. There were other passengers she needed to speak to. As she made her way back toward the lounge, her thoughts turned to the others she had observed earlier, the pale woman and the older gentleman, both of whom seemed to carry secrets of their own. Chapter 3. 3 Faces of Guilt. The Ireland Express's once luxurious, tranquil atmosphere now felt thick with unease. Word of Albert Manning's murder had begun to spread among the passengers. Jane made her way to the lounge, a plush compartment near the front of the train, where some passengers had gathered. Dim lamps cast a soft glow over the velvet-lined chairs and mahogany tables. Seated by the window, staring intently into his untouched drink, was Charles Dunbar, the stiff, military-like businessman who had claimed to be traveling with Manning on business. Jane approached him, noting the rigid set of his shoulders, the tight grip on his glass. He was a man accustomed to control, and right now, that control was slipping. Mr. Dunbar, Jane said, I believe we were due for a conversation. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Detective, he greeted, gesturing to the seat across from him. "I suppose you'll want to question me." "Indeed." Jane sat down. "You mentioned earlier that you were traveling with Mr. Manning on business. I'd like to know more about that business and your relationship with him." Dunbar exhaled sharply through his nose, as though the mere act of explaining himself was beneath him. "Albert Manning and I had a complicated relationship. We were business partners, of sorts. We both worked in the steel industry. Manning had recently acquired a controlling interest in a company I've been trying to gain a foothold in for years. Needless to say, it created tension between us." "Tension?" Jane's eyebrows arched. "What kind of tension?" Dunbar's jaw tightened. "We disagreed on how the company should be run. I believed in expansion, modernization, growth into new markets. Manning, however, was more conservative. He wanted to focus on stabilizing profits and maintaining the status quo. It was frustrating, to say the least." "And this disagreement, did it ever escalate?" Jane asked. Dunbar's gaze shifted away for a brief moment, his hand gripping the glass a little tighter. "We argued, yes. We've had a few heated exchanges in the past. But that's normal in business, Detective. Disagreements don't equate to murder." "Perhaps not," Jane agreed, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "But financial motives have led to worse crimes. You mentioned you had a disagreement earlier today with Mr. Manning. What was it about?" Dunbar hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "It wasn't anything major. Manning and we disagreed on a potential merger deal with another company. He wanted to wait it out, see how the market shifted, but I thought we should act immediately. We exchanged words, but that's all." Jane nodded slowly, watching him carefully. His answers were precise, almost rehearsed, but there was something simmering beneath the surface, an emotion he was keeping tightly in check. Still, it wasn't enough to pin a murder on him. Not yet. "Where were you when Mr. Manning was killed?" she asked, changing tack. "In my compartment," Dunbar replied instantly. "I stayed there after our argument. I needed time to cool off, to think." "Can anyone vouch for that?" He frowned, clearly not appreciating this. "No, I was alone." Jane stood up. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Dunbar. I'll be in touch if I need further clarification." Dunbar nodded stiffly, turning his attention back to the window. Jane's next stop was the compartment of Miss Evelyn Hargrave, the pale, anxious-looking governess who had caught Jane's attention from the moment she boarded the train. Miss Hargrave had been travelling alone, seated quietly at dinner, barely touching her food. There was something about her demeanour that suggested she was carrying a heavy burden. Jane knocked softly on the door of Miss Hargrave's compartment. After a brief pause, the door creaked open, revealing the governess standing in the narrow space. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the door. "Detective Parsons," she greeted in a whisper, her voice wavering. I heard about what happened. It's dreadful." "Yes, it is," Jane replied gently, though her tone remained professional. "May I come in? I'd like to ask you a few questions." Miss Hargrave hesitated for a moment, but then she stepped aside, allowing Jane to enter. The compartment was modest but neat, with a small suitcase tucked away beneath the seat and a book lying open on the table. "I know this must be a shock," Jane said as she sat down, "but I need to understand everyone's movements and connections to Mr. Manning. Did you know him?" Miss Hargrave sat across from her, wringing her hands. "No, not personally. I had never met him before this trip. I knew of him, of course. His name carries weight in certain circles, but I never had any dealings with him." Jane observed her closely. "Where were you around the time Mr. Manning was killed?" "In my compartment," Miss Hargrave replied quickly. "I wasn't feeling well after dinner, so I came back here to lie down." "Were you alone?" "Yes," she said, her eyes flitting to the floor. I don't know anyone else on this train." Jane leaned forward slightly. "You seem very anxious, Miss Hargrave. Is there something else troubling you?" Miss Hargrave's breath hitched slightly, and for a moment, Jane thought she might confess something, some hidden secret that had nothing to do with the murder, but everything to do with her demeanor. But instead, the governess shook her head, blinking rapidly as if trying to compose herself. "No," she said, "I'm just shaken by what's happened. It's horrible, but I don't know anything." Jane held her gaze for a long moment, sensing that Miss Hargrave was holding something back. "Very well," Jane said, standing up. "If you think of anything else, please come find me." Miss Hargrave nodded, her eyes downcast as Jane left the compartment. Outside, Jane paused for a moment, considering. Miss Hargrave had no apparent connection to Manning, but her anxiety ran deeper than a mere stranger's reaction to a murder. There was something hidden beneath the surface. Lastly, Jane headed toward the compartment of Mrs. Claire Lewis, the charming socialite whose bright demeanor at dinner had seemed out of place on such a quiet, night-bound journey. As Jane knocked on her door, she braced herself for a different sort of conversation. The door swung open, revealing Mrs. Lewis standing there in a deep blue velvet dress, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the late hour. She flashed a wide, disarming smile at Jane, but there was something almost too perfect about it. "Detective," she greeted with a slight flourish. "What an eventful evening we're having, isn't it?" Jane gave a tight smile in return, stepping inside. The compartment was lavish, reflecting Mrs. Lewis's wealth and taste. There were silk scarves draped across the seats, a delicate perfume lingering in the air. "Quite eventful," Jane agreed, sitting down across from her. "I understand you were acquainted with Mr. Manning." Mrs. Lewis laughed lightly, her voice like tinkling bells. "Oh, I wouldn't say acquainted. We've crossed paths at a few social functions, of course, but nothing beyond pleasantries. He was hardly the sort I'd seek out for company." Jane raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" Mrs. Lewis waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, Albert Manning was— how should I put this? Dreadfully dull, all business and no charm. I much prefer the company of people who know how to enjoy life." Her tone was light, but Jane sensed an undercurrent of disdain. "Were you in your compartment when Mr. Manning was killed?" Mrs. Lewis's eyes sparkled. "I was indeed. I had planned on visiting the lounge, but the night took a rather dreadful turn, didn't it?" Jane leaned in, her voice lowering slightly. "Tell me, Mrs. Lewis, what's your impression of the other passengers on this train? Anyone stand out to you?" The socialite smiled coyly. "Oh, my dear, everyone stands out in their own way. But if you're asking who might be capable of such a terrible deed, well, I wouldn't dream of speculating. That's your job, isn't it?" Jane nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Lewis was enjoying this far too much. The woman's sharp wit and polished exterior could easily hide something darker beneath. As she left Mrs. Lewis's compartment, Jane knew one thing for certain. Each of the 3 passengers had secrets, and each was capable of deception. Chapter 4: The Poisonous Truth. Jane sat in her compartment, reviewing her notes. The Ireland Express had turned into a rolling crucible of suspicion and lies. Dunbar, with his tense, guarded demeanor, seemed to have the most obvious motive, a heated business rivalry with Manning. But the others, Evelyn Hargrave and Claire Lewis, were no less intriguing. Miss Hargrave, with her skittish, nervous air, might have been a stranger to Manning, but there was an anxiety about her that suggested more than the shock of a murder. And Mrs. Lewis, the vibrant socialite, masked her emotions behind an air of charm and ease, though Jane sensed a hidden sharpness. Still, none of them had alibis. None of them had anyone to vouch for their whereabouts at the time of the murder. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Jane looked up, frowning slightly as she stood and opened the door. It was the stewardess again, her face pale and troubled. "Detective," the young woman said, her voice trembling. "There's been another incident." Jane's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of incident?" "The woman, Miss Hargrave," the stewardess stammered, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "She's collapsed in her compartment. She's unconscious and there's foam around her mouth. It looks like she's been poisoned. Poisoned. Poison wasn't a weapon of rage. It was deliberate, premeditated. Whoever had killed Albert Manning was now trying to cover their tracks, or silence another loose end. "Take me to her," Jane said immediately, grabbing her coat from the hook and following the stewardess down the narrow corridor. They reached Miss Hargrave's compartment quickly. A small crowd of concerned passengers had gathered nearby, their whispers filling the air with speculation and fear. Jane pushed past them and entered the compartment, where she found the governess lying on the floor, unconscious. A glass of water was overturned on the small table, and indeed, as the stewardess had said, there was foam around her mouth, a telltale sign of poisoning. Kneeling beside her, Jane checked Miss Hargrave's pulse. It was faint but still present. She needed immediate help. "Get the conductor," Jane ordered the stewardess, "and find out if there's a doctor aboard. We need to stabilize her." The stewardess rushed out as Jane remained crouched by the young woman's side, her mind racing. Miss Hargrave's collapse changed everything. Either she had been a target from the beginning, or she had seen or heard something that made her dangerous to the murderer. Jane's eyes swept the room, looking for any clue that might shed light on the situation. The overturned glass caught her attention. Poison could have easily been administered through the water, but who had brought it? The train staff or someone else? Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a man in his late 50s, wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a worn leather doctor's bag. His face was lined with worry, but his movements were steady and efficient as he knelt beside Miss Hargrave. "I'm Dr. Forbes," he introduced himself quickly. "Let me see her." Jane stepped aside as Dr. Forbes took over, examining Miss Hargrave with the calm detachment of a seasoned physician. He checked her pulse, examined her pupils, and lifted the edge of her sleeve to study her skin. "It's poison, all right," he muttered grimly. "Likely something fast-acting, given how quickly she's deteriorated. We need to neutralize it as soon as possible," Dr. Forbes said, pulling a small vial from his bag. "This should counteract most common poisons, at least temporarily, but we'll need to get her proper medical attention soon." He administered the antidote, and within moments, Miss Hargrave's breathing seemed to ease, though she remained unconscious. When Dr. Forbes finished, he looked up at Jane, his expression grave. "She's stable for now, but she'll need rest." Jane nodded. "Thank you, Doctor. Please keep me informed if her condition changes." With Miss Hargrave out of immediate danger, Jane stepped out of the compartment and back into the corridor, where the crowd of passengers had only grown. They looked at her with wide, anxious eyes, murmuring among themselves as Jane closed the door behind her. "Everyone, return to your compartments," Jane said, her voice firm but calm. "There's no need for panic. I'm investigating the situation." The passengers reluctantly dispersed, but the tension in the air was palpable. She headed toward the lounge, where she hoped to find Charles Dunbar and Claire Lewis. Both of them needed to be questioned again, particularly Dunbar, whose demeanor had been suspicious from the start. If Miss Hargrave had been poisoned, that meant the killer had access to the train's resources, possibly even the staff. Jane entered the lounge to find Dunbar seated in the same spot as before, his posture stiff. "Mr. Dunbar," Jane said, approaching him, "we need to talk. Again." Dunbar looked up, his expression hardening. "What is it this time, Detective?" Jane sat across from him. "Miss Hargrave has been poisoned. She's currently unconscious but stable." His eyes widened slightly, though his expression remained largely controlled. "Poisoned? That's unexpected." "Is it?" Jane asked coolly. "You seem to be taking it in stride." "I don't know the woman," Dunbar replied tersely. "What's that got to do with me?" "You tell me," Jane said, her gaze unwavering. "You were Manning's business partner, and now he's dead. Miss Hargrave, who had no apparent connection to him, has been poisoned. Yet you seem remarkably calm about all of it. Why is that?" Dunbar's lips pressed into a thin line. Because I don't know anything about this poison business. I didn't kill Manning, and I didn't poison the governess. You're barking up the wrong tree. Jane's eyes narrowed. I'll be the judge of that. Where were you when Miss Hargrave collapsed? In my compartment, as I was earlier, Dunbar replied stiffly. I haven't left it except to come here. And can anyone verify that? Dunbar's jaw clenched. No, I don't have an alibi, but that doesn't make me a murderer. Jane studied him for a long moment. I'll be speaking with Mrs. Lewis next, Jane said, rising to her feet. I suggest you stay close, Mr. Dunbar. This investigation is far from over. Jane found Mrs. Lewis in the lounge as well, seated near the bar with a glass of champagne in hand. Her demeanour was as bright and charming as ever. Detective, Mrs. Lewis greeted her with a sparkling smile. I hear the governess has taken ill. Quite tragic, isn't it? It is, Jane said evenly. Poisoning, to be precise. Mrs. Lewis raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a slight smirk. Poison? How terribly dramatic. It sounds like something out of a novel. Jane didn't return the smile. This isn't a novel, Mrs. Lewis. This is real life, and someone is trying to cover their tracks. Oh, don't look at me, dear, Mrs. Lewis said with a soft laugh. I wouldn't dream of harming anyone. Poison is such a messy business, don't you think? It depends on the poison, Jane replied, her tone sharp. Where were you when Miss Hargrave was poisoned? In my compartment, naturally, Mrs. Lewis said lightly. I was resting after dinner. You can ask the stewardess. I had her bring me a cup of tea. Jane studied Mrs. Lewis's face carefully. Beneath the polished exterior, there was a glimmer of something more, something cunning. The socialite was playing her own game, and Jane would have to be just as careful as she pursued the truth. Chapter 5. A trap is set. With Miss Hargrave poisoned and now under Dr. Forbes's care, the urgency of solving this case had escalated dramatically. Whoever had killed Albert Manning wasn't just trying to eliminate one person. They were silencing witnesses, covering their tracks. Jane needed to act quickly before the killer struck again. She paced the length of her compartment, her mind racing through the details. Dunbar, Lewis, and Hargrave, they were all entangled in this somehow. But the poison changed everything. It wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was methodical, thoughtful, planned. The click of the compartment door interrupted her thoughts. The stewardess entered, carrying a fresh pot of tea. Miss Parsons, she said, placing the tray on the small table. I thought you might need this after everything that's happened. Jane nodded her thanks. The stewardess hesitated, glancing at her as though she had something on her mind. Is there something else? Jane asked. The stewardess wrung her hands nervously. I just thought you should know, ma'am. There's been some talk among the staff. They're afraid. We've never had anything like this happen on the train before. I understand, Jane said, her voice softening slightly. It's natural to be afraid. But you need to stay calm. Panic won't help us solve this. Of course, the stewardess replied quickly. She then added, almost as an afterthought, there is something else. I don't know if it matters, but I saw Mrs. Lewis speaking to one of the conductors earlier. She looked, I don't know, upset. It was strange. Strange how? Jane's curiosity piqued. Well, Mrs. Lewis is usually so calm, so put together. But when I passed them, I heard her voice. She sounded tense, almost panicked. And the conductor, well, he looked very uncomfortable, like he wanted to get away from her as quickly as possible. Jane's brow furrowed. Claire Lewis had appeared so composed, but perhaps that was just a front. The pressure of the situation could be making her slip. Was she involved with the conductor in some way, or was there another connection? Thank you for telling me, Jane said. Please, continue to keep your ears open, but don't endanger yourself. The stewardess gave a small nod before slipping out of the compartment. Later that evening, Jane decided it was time to set a trap for the killer. Whoever had poisoned Miss Hargrave must have had access to her compartment and, crucially, the poison itself. It was likely that the same poison could be used again if the killer felt threatened. Jane would make sure to put herself in the killer's sights. She found Dr. Forbes in the makeshift infirmary set up in the rear carriage, where Miss Hargrave was resting. Her face was pale, but the doctor assured Jane that she would recover with time. Miss Hargrave had been incredibly lucky. Any delay, and she would have died. "Dr. Forbes," Jane said, "I need your assistance with something delicate." The older man raised a brow. "I'm listening." "I intend to set a trap for the murderer, but it requires your cooperation. I need you to spread word that Miss Hargrave is awake and conscious, that she's in a fit state to make a statement. Make it known that I'll be questioning her this evening about what she may have seen before the attack." Dr. Forbes's eyes widened slightly as he caught on. "And you think the killer will attempt to silence her once more?" Jane gave a sharp nod. "Exactly. Miss Hargrave must remain under close supervision, but I need the murderer to believe she's still a threat. I'll be waiting to catch them in the act." The doctor hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the risk involved, but eventually he nodded. "Very well, Detective. I'll make sure the rumor's spread." By evening, the entire train was buzzing with the news. Miss Hargrave was awake, the passengers whispered to one another. She had survived the poisoning, and she was ready to talk. Jane made a point of being visible, moving between compartments and ensuring the passengers saw her. She wanted the killer to feel cornered, desperate enough to make a mistake. At 8:30, Jane stationed herself in the narrow corridor just outside Miss Hargrave's compartment. The door was slightly ajar, enough to give the illusion that someone could easily slip inside without being seen. Jane positioned herself around the corner, hidden from view but with a clear line of sight to the compartment. Time passed slowly, the rhythmic clattering of the train's wheels, the only sound to break the silence. She knew the killer would strike soon, but when? Suddenly she heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, deliberately quiet but unmistakable. Someone was approaching. Her breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself further into the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, then paused just outside Miss Hargrave's door. There was a long, agonizing silence. And then, a shadow moved, a figure slipping inside the compartment with practiced ease. Jane waited a beat longer, giving the intruder just enough time to make their move. Then, with a swift and silent motion, she stepped into the doorway, her eyes locking on the figure bent over Miss Hargrave's bed. "Step away," Jane commanded, her voice sharp as steel. The figure froze, slowly straightening and turning to face her. In the dim light, Jane could just make out the familiar features of Charles Dunbar. He looked stunned, his hand hovering over the bedside table, where a vial of liquid glistened in the faint light. Poison. "Mr. Dunbar," Jane said coldly, "I'd hoped you wouldn't fall into the trap so easily." Dunbar's expression shifted from shock to cold fury. "You don't understand," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "She saw something she shouldn't have. If she talks, it's over for me." Jane stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Over for you, or over for the person you're protecting?" Dunbar's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "You didn't act alone, did you?" she asked softly, moving closer to him. "Manning's murder, the poisoning, it wasn't just you. Who are you covering for, Mr. Dunbar? Who are you willing to risk everything for?" For a moment she thought he might lash out, but instead he dropped the vial onto the table with a soft clink. His shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. "Claire," he muttered, barely audible. It was Claire. Jane's eyes narrowed. Claire Lewis, the woman who had seemed too poised, too polished to be involved. But of course her charm was a facade. She and Dunbar had been in this together from the start. Before she could press further, the door behind her swung open with force, and there stood Claire Lewis, her eyes blazing with anger and fear. "I told you to leave it alone, Charles," she spat, her voice trembling. "Now look what you've done." Chapter 6. Unraveling the Threads. The silence that followed Claire Lewis's sudden entrance was thick and oppressive. For a moment, none of them moved, the tension crackling in the small compartment like an electric current. Jane Parsons stood her ground, her sharp eyes fixed on Claire, who hovered in the doorway, her chest heaving as if she'd just run a great distance. Charles Dunbar, defeated, slumped against the edge of the bed, his gaze averted in shame. Jane broke the silence first. "Well, Mrs. Lewis, it seems your companion has just implicated you in quite the conspiracy. Would you care to explain yourself?" Claire's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something more, fear. "Charles doesn't know what he's talking about," Claire said sharply, stepping into the room with a forced air of composure. "He's lying. He's trying to save himself by dragging me into this mess." Jane arched a brow. "A convenient excuse. But you see, Mrs. Lewis, I don't believe in coincidences. First Manning is murdered, then Miss Hargrave is poisoned. And now you both find yourselves caught here, in the act of attempting to finish what you started." Charles looked up at Claire, his face pale. "Stop lying, Claire. We're already finished." His voice was hoarse, broken. "It's over." Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. "You fool. Do you really think they'll believe her? You think—" "They don't need to believe me," Jane interjected, her tone sharp. "The facts will speak for themselves. Charles was caught with poison in his hand. He admitted his involvement, and you have far too much to explain for a simple denial to save you." "Fine," she said quietly. "You want the truth? I'll tell you, but you won't like what you hear." Claire sat down in the small compartment, crossing her arms as she gathered her thoughts. "It started months ago," Claire began, her voice low. "I was in financial trouble. My husband had left me with nothing but debts, and I was desperate. Albert Manning approached me at a party one evening. He knew about my situation, and he had a proposition." Jane's eyes narrowed. "What kind of proposition?" Claire sighed. "He was involved in something. Illegal. Smuggling, I think. I didn't ask for details. All I knew was that he had access to valuable information, documents, contacts, things that could be sold to the right people for a great deal of money. He wanted me to help him. I'd act as a middleman, using my connections in society to discreetly pass information to his buyers." Jane considered this. "So you became his partner?" Claire nodded, though there was no pride in her expression. "It wasn't glamorous, detective. It was survival. Manning provided me with enough money to keep my creditors at bay. In return, I played my part in his scheme." "And Charles?" Jane glanced over at Dunbar. "Where does he fit into this?" Claire's eyes flicked to Charles, her expression softening slightly. "Charles was my confidant. He found out about the arrangement by accident. I told him everything when I realized I couldn't do it alone." "I loved her," Charles muttered, his voice barely audible. "I wanted to protect her. I thought if I helped her, maybe we could escape all of it." Claire shot him a look. "You were never supposed to be involved, Charles. I didn't want you mixed up in this." Claire fell silent for a moment, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Then, with a deep breath, she continued. "A few weeks ago, Manning told me he was planning to leave the operation. He said it had become too dangerous, that people were starting to ask questions. He wanted out, and he wanted to sell the information he had on his buyers to make a clean break." Jane frowned. "Why didn't you leave with him? Surely if you were in financial trouble, the sale could have benefited you both." Claire's lips tightened. "Because he didn't intend to share the profits with me. He was going to cut me out completely, leave me behind to deal with the fallout." "And that's when you decided to kill him?" Jane asked. Claire met her gaze unflinchingly. "Yes, I couldn't let him walk away, not after everything I'd done. He knew too much, and if he was willing to betray me once, he'd do it again." Jane nodded, the pieces falling into place. "So you and Charles concocted the plan to kill Manning aboard the train." "But you couldn't stop there," Jane pressed. "When Miss Hargrave started asking questions, you realized she was a threat, so you tried to silence her too." Claire's jaw clenched. "I didn't want to, but she wouldn't stop. She kept asking about Manning, about what happened. She was too clever for her own good. "And now here we are," Jane said softly. "Two people dead, and all because you couldn't let go of your greed." She turned her attention to Charles. "And you, Mr. Dunbar? Why did you go along with all of this?" Charles lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed with guilt. I thought I could protect her. I thought if I helped her with Manning, we could leave this life behind. But when she asked me to help with the poison for Miss Hargrave, I couldn't do it. I came in here tonight to try and stop her, to make sure she didn't hurt anyone else." Jane studied him for a long moment. There was sincerity in his words, but he was still guilty. He had played his part in the murder of Manning, and now he had to face the consequences. "You could have stopped this at any point," Jane said quietly, "but you chose to go along with it, and now two people are dead." Charles hung his head in silence. Jane took a deep breath, her mind racing through the next steps. The authorities would be waiting at the next station, ready to take Claire and Charles into custody. As the train hurtled through the night toward its final destination, Jane felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The killer had been caught, but at great cost. 2 lives were lost, and nothing would bring them back. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. As the Island Express approached its final destination, a somber silence hung over the train. Jane Parsons sat in her compartment, staring out at the darkened landscape as it whipped past the window. Claire Lewis and Charles Dunbar were now under guard in a separate carriage, awaiting their inevitable fate when the train arrived at the next station. The door to her compartment slid open, and the stewardess, looking pale and anxious, entered. "Detective Parsons, the inspector will be boarding at the next stop to take Mrs. Lewis and Mr. Dunbar into custody. I thought you should know." Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper. Jane nodded. "Thank you. I'll be ready when they arrive." The stewardess lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to say more. Jane waited, sensing there was something on her mind. "Is it true?" the stewardess asked after a pause. "About Mrs. Lewis and the murder?" Jane met the young woman's eyes. There was fear there, fear and the unmistakable need for reassurance. "Yes," Jane replied gently. "It's true. Mrs. Lewis and Mr. Dunbar were responsible for the death of Mr. Manning, and they attempted to kill Miss Hargrave as well." The stewardess's face paled further. "But why? Why would they do something so horrible?" Jane sighed. How could she explain the complexity of human emotions? The toxic blend of desperation, greed, and fear that had led to Manning's murder. "Sometimes people make choices when they feel trapped. Choices that spiral out of control," Jane said softly. Claire Lewis believed she had no other option. She was driven by fear, fear of losing everything, fear of being exposed. But once you take that first step into darkness, it's easy to lose your way. The stewardess's eyes shimmered with understanding but also sadness. "And Mr. Dunbar? Did he help her willingly?" Jane hesitated. He loved her, and love can make people do foolish things. He thought he was protecting her, but in the end, he only became another pawn in her game. The stewardess nodded, though the sorrow in her expression lingered. She excused herself quietly, leaving Jane alone with her thoughts once more. The train rolled into the station shortly after midnight. As it slowed to a halt, Jane could see a group of uniformed officers who stood waiting. Among them was Inspector Hayward, a stern-looking man with a strong jaw and silvering hair, who had been summoned by telegraph to oversee the arrest of Claire Lewis and Charles Dunbar. Jane watched from the window as the officers approached the train, and she prepared herself for the final confrontation. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. It was Dr. Forbes, looking more weary than usual. He gave her a tight smile as he stepped into the compartment. "Detective Parsons," he said with a nod, "I just came to let you know that Miss Hargrave is awake and out of danger. The antidote worked." Jane felt a wave of relief wash over her. At least there had been one life saved amidst the chaos. "Thank you, Doctor. That's good news. I'll need to speak with her once things have settled." Dr. Forbes hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. You've done well, Detective. This case, it's been difficult, but you've managed to bring the truth to light. However, I must ask, how did you know it was Claire? What tipped you off?" Jane leaned back in her seat, recalling the chain of events that had led her to the truth. "It was a number of small things," she began. At first, Claire seemed too composed, too unaffected by Manning's death. When Miss Hargrave started asking questions, Claire panicked. She feared Miss Hargrave had seen or overheard something that could incriminate her. Poisoning her was Claire's attempt to silence a potential witness. But it was sloppy, rushed. It showed that she was afraid, that she was losing control. Dr. Forbes nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And Mr. Dunbar? Did he really try to stop her in the end?" Jane pursed her lips. "Yes, I believe he did. But it was too late. He was already complicit in Manning's murder, and when Claire asked him to help with the poison for Miss Hargrave, his conscience got the better of him. That's why he hesitated tonight. He knew what Claire was doing was wrong, but by then, he was in too deep." Dr. Forbes sighed, shaking his head. What a tragic mess. Outside on the platform, Inspector Hayward and his officers escorted Claire Lewis and Charles Dunbar from the train. "Claire Lewis, you are under arrest for the murder of Albert Manning and the attempted murder of Miss Hargrave," Inspector Hayward said formally, as he placed handcuffs on her wrists. "And Charles Dunbar, you are charged as an accomplice." As the two were led away, Claire turned her head slightly, her eyes locking with Jane's through the window of the train. For a brief moment, her poised mask slipped, revealing a flicker of vulnerability. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened once more, and she disappeared into the night, swallowed by the shadows. Later, after the commotion had died down and the station had emptied of passengers, Jane stood alone on the platform. "Detective Parsons?" Jane turned to see Inspector Hayward approaching, his face softened with understanding. "You've done fine work here. You should be proud." Jane offered a faint smile. "Thank you, Inspector, but I can't help thinking about the cost." Hayward nodded. "There's always a cost in cases like this. But you did your duty. You uncovered the truth, and that's what matters." Jane nodded, and with one last glance at the Ireland Express, now still and quiet on the tracks, she turned and walked away, ready to face whatever lay ahead.